everybody. My name is Tanya Kokar. I'm a senior policy expert with the International Center for Research on Women. Again, reminder, please introduce yourselves in the chat function. Tell us who you are, where you're connecting from. Also, let's use this chat function throughout the event to pose any questions. We want to make sure this is a dynamic conversation. We want to encourage everyone to participate and engage. So please ask questions, post comments in the chat function, and we'll make sure we bring them to the speakers at the end of the session. This event is recorded, several events happening, really interesting ones at the same time as this one. So we want to make sure we record it and we send it with to our other partners who are unable to join. Unfortunately, there's only English, there's no translation today. So for our non-English speaking attendees, our apologies, and hope you can follow the conversation well in English. I want to remind us about the two hashtags that we're using today. It's NGBV and ratify C190. We'll also put them in the chat function so you can use these for social media. Our event today will be focusing on important themes of gender-based violence, economic justice, and decent work. Our panelists will share the scope and relevance of C190. They'll talk about the ratification process, what progress has been made, and how we can leverage the Generation Equality Forum to get traction on these two important action coalition themes for GBV and economic justice and rights. At the end of the panel, we'll also have some time for Q&A. And again, please use the chat function for any questions, comments, introduce yourselves, and kind request to please mute your audios so we have no background noise as the speakers join the panel soon. I'm very excited for this conversation and really, really grateful to all our speakers who are not just here for and committing to this time to participate during a very heavy CSW schedule, but also for the incredibly important work they're doing to advance gender justice and gender equality in their contexts. I'd also like to give a shout out to my team at ICRW. You know who you are, who helped with the planning. So deep appreciation for all the work that you do. Let me now introduce you to our wonderful moderator, Kemi. I can't tell you how thrilled I am that you're here with us. Kemi is the Director of Knowledge Management and Learning at Prospera. She has over 20 years of experience in supporting women and girls, human rights, local organizations, and movements in Nigeria, Zambia, and Senegal. Kemi is the co-founder of Education as a Vaccine, a leading nonprofit to advance adolescent and young people's rights to health, including sexual reproductive health and rights in Nigeria. She was a member of research for 10 years and has worked with like-minded feminists to support the formation of other feminist networks and alliances to enable young women to advocate for the advancement of the rights of women and girls in Africa. With that, a warm welcome to you, Kemi, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. And good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. We're really excited to have you all join this event today. And I'm really grateful to also have the privilege and opportunity to moderate on behalf of the team. So just to get us started, and I know that our speakers are gonna go into a lot more depth because this is their area of expertise and they have very diverse views and perspectives to share with us today. But to give you a little bit of context around what we're gonna be discussing today, and we're gonna be talking a lot about Convention number 190 and looking at it within the theme of GBV in the world of work. So really exploring more the intersects between gender-based violence and economic justice and gender justice. So I just want to take us a bit back and just to refresh our minds around what the Convention 190 is. In 2019, the International Labor Conference adopted this particular convention and its accompanying recommendations. And really, it's supposed to serve as the framework that provides a clear roadmap for preventing and addressing gender-based violence, violence, and harassment within the workplace. It recognizes the right of everyone to a world that's free of violence, harassment, and intimidation. And it goes into a lot of details around identifying what are some of these sort of what entails or what is in this definition of violence and harassment. And so it doesn't just only look at from a physical point of view, but also looking at, from a psychological input and also from an economic point.
Ready to go?
I'm writing a newsletter, yeah.
Okay. Sorry, if you're on, please, can you put your mic on mute for us, please? Thank you so much. All right. Now, given the context that we're in a year into this pandemic, the reality is that the COVID-19 pandemic has really reshaped, everything that we know. We've gone from, what we thought was the normal to a new normal, as a community, as a society, as a globe. And the reality is that this pandemic has significantly shaped the way we work. I'm talking to you today from my home, and I'm sure many of us on this call are joining from our homes or from other places, because where we have traditionally worked from, it's no longer possible. But beyond just the change in our sort of work environment, we also need to think about what impact the pandemic has had on the ways we work. How is this affecting the informal economy? How is it affecting the formal economy? How is it addressing or affecting individuals that are in a more vulnerable situation? And what we've seen is that individuals, especially women in the informal economy, are also the most vulnerable. We're seeing that the pandemic is really having a huge impact on exacerbating, the gender stereotypes, pushing forward unhelpful perceptions of masculinity, and is really leading to an increase in the number of women that are going into unpaid care work, and the burden that comes with that. So thinking through the issues relating to financial insecurity and employment, this has obviously led to a spike and an increase in gender-based violence statistics that we're seeing, and many groups and organizations and women have been reporting on this. So it's really important for us to think about how the pandemic has really heightened the risk for violence and harassment, not just in terms of the homes, which have now become our new workplace, but also thinking about how women and persons with disability particularly are most affected through this. Now, the reality is, across our countries, most of our national laws and policies don't offer enough protection. And the convention actually is really critical to help us to uphold these rights. Unfortunately, only 4 countries have completed the ratification process till date. But we see the conversations that we're having today, but also the opportunity around the Generation Equality Forum as a unique space to be able to help to reinvigorate the commitment, to be able to bolster up commitments and take advantage of that momentum to be able to call for full adoption, ratification, as well as full implementation of Convention 119. So with that being said, and I hope that it's giving you a little bit of an introduction into what we're going to talk about, but you all didn't come here for me, you came here for the speakers. I have the privilege to introduce to you 3 really amazing speakers that represent a diversity of stakeholders that are working on the issues of gender justice and economic justice. Our first panelist is Anya Bacharji. And I apologize for battering her name, especially since I also have a complicated name, who's from the Asia Floor Wage Alliance. She's the international coordinator for this institution, which is a global supply chain campaign for living wages and a violence-free workplace for garment workers in Asia, who are mainly women, or mostly women, and who produce most of the world's clothing. She's the president of the Garment and Allied Workers Union in North India. She's helped to build grassroots labor-related collaborations between North America, Europe, and Asia for well over a decade. And she's written a wide variety of publications and have spoken quite extensively about social justice issues and importance of movements in securing gender justice and economic justice. So we're really pleased and excited to have Anya as part of our speaker today. So you're welcome. Our second panelist is Chidi King, who is from the International Trade Union Confederation. Chidi is the Director of Equality Department at the International Trade Union Confederation. That department deals with a wide range of gender issues and the intersectionality and issues around global governance of migration. Chidi has worked on equality, employment rights, civil liberties issues with the UK Trade Union Congress as the Equality and Rights Officer within the Global Union Federation Public Service International, and is also a senior lawyer, or has worked as a senior lawyer with public interest disclosure charity protection, also known as the public concern at work. Chidi is a graduate of law from University of Birmingham and from the Inns of Court School of Law, now the City Law School within the UK. We're really excited to have you, Chidi, join us today. And our third panelist is Ms. Mary Kabiru, who's the Deputy Director of Policy Research with the Government of Kenya. Mary is a gender specialist with over 20 years of experience in gender policy development and women and girls' socio-economic empowerment. She's in charge of treaties and convention section within the State Department of Gender, where she's a lead and focal point for Kenya's reporting obligation regarding conventions, regional and global related to gender. This includes at a national level, being the technical lead for CSW and the CEDAW process. In her role, she coordinates partnership across states and non-state actors to ensure that Kenya's obligation and commitments to gender equality and women empowerment are met. Currently, Mary is the focal point for the government of Kenya as a liaison for the Generation Equality Forum process in particular, and is a technical representative for the Gender-Based Violence Action Coalition. So we're really excited to have all three. As you can see, they represent a wide variety of stakeholders, from the civil society to trade union to government, and they're going to really bring a very enriching perspective into the conversation that we're going to have today. So we're really excited to have them. And so, with that being said, and with a mouthful, I think it's really important for us to sort of like dive into the conversation that we're all here for. And I want to kind of start by setting the tone with really giving each of the speakers an opportunity to sort of introduce themselves and provide us like a sense of, what their organization or their government, in the case of Mary, is doing to really enhance women in all their diversity and ensuring their rights and dignity to be free from violence and harassment, especially within the workplace, and contextualize this a little bit for us within the context of the Generation Equality Fund. The Generation Equality Forum. And I want to start off with Chidi, if it's okay for you to go ahead and kick us off, and then from there we'll move to Anaya, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kemi, and hello, everybody. Greetings to you wherever you are. Let me start, first of all, by thanking ICRW for inviting the ITUC to be part of this important webinar. So the ITUC, International Trade Union Confederation, is an umbrella body for trade union national centers worldwide. And of course, at the moment, we are campaigning very hard along with allies at national, regional, and global level for the ratification of Convention 190. And of course, its effective implementation in line with its recommendation. Trade unions, and again, campaigning alongside our allies, played a very important role in securing the adoption of this convention and its recommendation. It was very important to us because pretty much everywhere we went and spoke to our members, our women members in particular, violence and harassment in many forms. So of course, sexual harassment, but also other forms of gender-based violence and harassment, ranging from casual sexism, which has, you know, a deep impact of its own, through to serious assault, such as, you know, rape, through to psychosocial risks and hazards that many women face, either arising from bullying in the workplace or to other forms of vulnerabilities that arise due to their situation in the workplace. So for us, knowing this and knowing that there was a possibility of getting standard setting onto the agenda of the International Labour Conference was crucial. It was quite amazing for us to realize that despite steps that had been taken to address issues such as sexual harassment in the world of work, there was no international labor standard that actually dealt specifically with this issue. And this convention and its recommendation pay particular attention to the case of gender-based violence and harassment. As trade unions, the core of our work, of course, is to improve democracy in the world of work, and particularly the terms and conditions under which workers are employed, enabling workers to have a real say in their workplaces and to be able to bargain for their terms and conditions. And of course, that includes their wages. And we know the links between poverty, socioeconomic status, precarious working conditions, and the incidence of violence and harassment. So whilst everybody anywhere can and does often experience violence and harassment, we know that the risks are particularly acute if you happen to be working in a precarious job, if you happen to be on low pay, if you happen to be in an extremely subordinate position within your workplace. So the work of trade unions to ensure a strong voice, a strong collective voice in the workplace, and the ability, as I say, to bargain collectively is a crucial part of our efforts to eliminate gender-based violence and harassment in the workplace. And then finally, of course, we are trying to equip our members and workers generally with the tools to make this instruments a living reality for them. So raising awareness that the instruments exist in the first place is a key part of that. And then, you know, explaining how the instruments can actually help to bring about a world of work where violence and harassment, and in particular gender-based violence and harassment, are no longer tolerated, and that active prevention measures are taken. Where it does occur, that there's redress to remedy is a crucial part of all of that.
Thank you so much, Chidi. It's really amazing to hear about the, you know, wonderful work that you and your team are doing at the trade union. And so I want to give space to Anaya to also sort of share with us a bit more about her work and what she's doing at the Asia Floor Wage Alliance.
Thank you, Kemi, and thank you so much to ICRW for organizing this and for inviting Asia Floor Wage Alliance. And it's really an honor for me to also speak along with my esteemed colleagues on the panel. Asia Floor Wage Alliance is the only Asia-led global alliance on labor, which works on the issue of labor rights for garment workers who produce most of the world's clothing. And garment industry is a very important industry because it sets the norm for labor standards in developing countries. It's often the first industrial sector that women workers go into. And in the world of global supply chain, what we see in the garment or the fashion industry, let's say, which is dominated by fashion brands, we are seeing gender-based violence and harassment as not just an outlier incident. It is actually part of the business model of the global supply chain. It is part of the industrial relations culture in a workforce that profits from low wage workers and low price products, because it's like low prices in fashion and low wages of workers. That's sort of the model. And this necessarily means incorporating gender-based violence in the industrial relations in the factories. And this is really the big fight for us, because in Asia Florage Alliance, we do not see gender-based violence as only sexual assault. We have done an analysis and we have published our research where we have defined a GBVH spectrum, which is a broad spectrum from violence as well as the practices in the factory, which encompass factory industrial relations practices of various kinds, to all be included under the umbrella of GBVH. This gives us a framework for really looking at how women workers are disciplined in an industry that relies on women workers who are precariously employed with low wages. Given this as our analysis, our main work is to build both national level women workers leadership through trade unions, as well.
På sykehus helt ned I 20-årene.
So we build national leadership of women workers through trade unions, as well as a regional platform across Asia, so that Asian trade unions and women workers are united on their demands to the global fashion brands, who are really the drivers of the global supply chain. So we take a holistic view of GBVH, build bottom-up leadership through an approach that we call Safe Circle. And what our goal is to empower women workers ultimately to unionize in an industry which fights unions, which retaliates against unions. And we feel without ending gender-based violence, women workers cannot unionize. So it is really crucial for freedom of association that GBVH be eliminated. And so we've organized locally, regionally, and globally to hold brands accountable for elimination of GBVH and for the right to freedom of association in the global supply chain through the bottom-up process that we call Safe Circles to build the leadership of women workers in the labor movement.
Thank you so much, Anaya. I appreciate that. And it's, you can all see obviously from both their inputs and contribution, the connection between their work. And now we would like to hear from Ms. Mary to really hear a little bit more about the work from a member state or from a government perspective, and specifically focusing on the government of Kenya. So Ms. Mary, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kemi. Thank you, fellow panelists, and thank you for ICRW for inviting Kenya to take part in this discussion. And I want to apologize, my video is not working, but I believe I can still engage even without you seeing my face. So I'm really glad to be part of the discussion. And firstmost, I want to say that ILO C190 is a very, very important instrument. Kenya has not ratified it, but it does not in any way go against the Constitution of Kenya, and it does not in any way go against the legislation. So we believe this is a process that we'll be able to take up to see that it is ratified using the laid down legal procedures of ratification, because that one is normally guided by Treaty Making and Ratification Act of Kenya. And it is a process which requires public participation. It requires for people to understand the impact it's going to have, the implications, for example, the legal implication of ratification, the financial implication of the ratification, and the ratification has to be approved by Parliament. So it is a rigorous process. Nevertheless, as Kenya, we've been addressing issues of workplace gender-based violence. And one of the things I can say is that it is part of the performance contracting in Kenya for all ministries, departments, and agencies to develop workplace GBV policies, which addresses sexual harassment, and there are mechanisms in place to ensure compliance. So this is something we can say we have done. And those agencies report in terms of how implementation is going on. Then secondly, beyond just GBV, we are also trying to ensure that there is equality within the workplaces. And how are we doing this? One of the things that we are doing is that the government, in partnership with Kenya's private sector and UNICEF, has piloted a responsive work environment in support of lactating mothers and pregnant women by providing them with a restroom. This lactation station illustrates the structural models for enhancing social protection for breastfeeding mothers. And you can ensure that when they're able to have such resting room, they're able to breastfeed their children. That means that they can also be able to do their work very effectively and increase their productivity at the workplace. So that is what I would want to say, some of the things we're doing as a country. Then when I go to the Generation Equality Action Coalition, or GBV, that Kenya is a co-leader with other leaders. One of the things we did during International Women's Day, we had an opportunity to be able to publicly share on the sub-themes and the priorities of the Action Coalition. And of course, one of the key things that we see emerging from there is that we have identified policy commitments that are really in line with ratification and implementation of the ILO Convention, because we want to ensure that countries that have not ratified the ILO Convention have ratified, and beyond that, that they will also implement the C190. So that one is coming out very, very clear in the commitments that we are working on with the other core leaders in this process. And then at the national level, we have set up a very strong country leadership structure that is going to ensure that Kenya engages effectively at the global level to ensure that we are able to make the transformative changes we want to see by the year 2026. And the structure looks like this. At the national level, we have the National Advisory Committee at the highest level. And then at the second level, we have the National Steering Committee. And we have a secretariat that we are setting up that is going to ensure that we engage effectively and we're able to meet these commitments and to be able to deliver on what we shall commit ourselves in Mexico and Paris in line with the Action Coalition Generation Equality GBV. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. It's really great to hear a bit about what the government of Kenya is doing. And I know we're going to come back to you to go into a little more detail. But just to take us back a step, and I would love to hear Chidi and Anaya's perspective on this. Why should we care about this convention? What is unique about it? What is interesting about it? And how does this relate to work at national level, but also within the unions, the trade unions, and with the groups that you work with as well, Anaya? So I don't know, maybe Anaya, would you like to start first? And then we'll immediately pass on to Chidi to go ahead and share her perspective.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, the Convention 190 was, I don't know, it's just one of the thrilling moments of not just the labor movement, but the women's movement. It has, we all see it as having given a global recognition to GBVH in the workplace within a cogent framework. It has given credibility, visibility, and we see definitely a global spike in the legitimacy that is given to the issue of GBVH and its importance. And really it is bringing together, it is giving us the impetus to bring gender and labor together. And as many of us know, these have often not worked together, but this is a fantastic opportunity. However, for those of us who have seen conventions, who have seen laws, we all know that all these instruments, fantastic as they are, because they are the results of movements, after their passage, they're only as good as the ground level capacity to mobilize, use them, and build off them. And the Convention 190 has given tremendous confidence to women leaders at the workplace within trade unions. But this is all lost unless we build the capacity of women leaders to then come together and mobilize. And really, we can, I come from a country which has actually a pretty good anti-sexual harassment act. And all countries in Asia do not have anti-sexual harassment laws, but to the extent that some countries have, that's good, that's great. However, we do see that they are poorly implemented unless women leaders from the ground level mobilize to see that they are implemented. Because the truth is that just that passage of things, laws and conventions, important as they are, and the commitment of the private sector to such conventions, important as it is, we must have collaboration that is across in the sector that I am in. For example, fashion brands, supplier factories, trade unions, and women leaders, they have to collaborate together, because just brands doing their trainings or the suppliers doing their trainings and women organizing, each sort of silo working, will not end the problem. In order to end the problem, we need for the three bodies, the tripartite bodies, to be having agreements to work in a transformational way. Because even within trade unions, we know that there is a dominance of male leadership, and that is what we have been trying to do in Asia Flourishing Alliance. We have created something called the Women's Leadership Committee, where every trade union has to nominate a women leader, and that's how we create this. So the Women's Leadership Committee represents the sector, suppliers and brands. Together, we need to come up with agreements to eliminate and prevent GBVH at the workplace. Because as I said earlier, this is not just sexual assault. This is very systematic gendered industrial relations as a business model. And therefore, the only way to really fight it is through systematic work. And so the C190 is extremely energizing for all of us. We include it as part of our trainings, our mobilization, and as an element of pride that this has given the recognition to this issue globally. And women workers are proud of it. Women leaders are proud of it. And this pride then translates into a confidence to organize locally.
Great, thank you. Chidi?
Thank you, and I can only echo everything that Ananya has said, so thank you for that. But yes, why should we care? Indeed, I should have mentioned at the outset that the ITC is a co-lead in the Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition. And economic rights are really inseparable from social, political, cultural rights. They are essential to women's autonomy and independence, including our bodily autonomy and independence. And all of these lie at the heart of the issues that this convention and its recommendation are seeking to address. As Ananya rightly pointed out in her first intervention, gender-based violence is something that's often used to quieten, to subjugate, to prevent women workers from exercising their voice and agency at work, to keep them in a subordinate position, to prevent them from organizing collectively. So again, this points to just how crucial this convention is. But what's extremely exciting about this convention is a comprehensive and holistic approach that it takes. So this wide definition of what is gender-based violence and harassment is already key. Again, not just about sexual harassment or assault, as important and prevalent as that is, but looking at issues around economic harm, looking at issues around psychological harm and psychosocial risks, addressing the impacts of domestic violence on the workplace. And this is quite a groundbreaking advance, the recognition that you can't always neatly, in fact, most of the time, you can't neatly separate what goes on in the home from what goes on in the workplace. And that if you're experiencing domestic violence at home, this almost necessarily will impact your situation at work. It will impact, of course, your productivity at work, but your ability to attend work in the first place. It will, increase your absenteeism at work. And if you're in a precarious working condition, it's very often, whether you, stay away from your abuser to survive, or whether, you lose your job because you're not able to attend the workplace. So a very important recognition there. This view that it takes of the world of work not just being the physical place of work, but recognizing that things like information technology, very crucial in this pandemic when so many are working from home, can play a part in facilitating violence and harassment, so cyberbullying, as we've talked about, that the commute to and from work is a place where violence and harassment can occur and therefore needs addressing. Recognizing that every worker, wherever he or she happens to be, especially where she happens to be, needs protection. So whether you're in the rural or urban areas, whether you're in the informal or the formal economy, whatever your contractual status is, whether you're still at the job seeking stage, or whether you're an apprentice, it really does cover everybody, very much in line with the SDG spirit of leaving no one behind. It covers third-party violence and harassment, recognizing that workers can also experience that from customers, but that customers and others can also experience violence and harassment from workers. So requiring that there is attention to all of those aspects. Again, recognizing that there are other factors that play into the experience of violence and harassment. Issues such as discrimination and inequality, requiring steps and measures to address those. Issues such as occupational health and safety. So embedding this very much within those mechanisms and requiring action around that. Finally, I'll say having a lens to groups or population groups, but also groups of workers who are particularly exposed to violence and harassment, and requiring action to be taken specifically to address the risks that arise from that. So even though it's not enunciated in the instruments themselves, we know that you have to pay attention to workers such as racialized workers, disabled workers, indigenous workers, workers from LGBTI communities. There's specific reference to migrant workers. So it really is, as I think it was Ananya again who mentioned, or it might have been you, Kemi, who mentioned this roadmap. It really does provide a roadmap and a blueprint to enable everybody, all actors, to address this pernicious issue of gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work.
Great, thank you so much. And with what all three of you have said and shared with us, when I was also doing more research about this, I was shocked to find out that only 4 countries had ratified. And so my question here is, and maybe Chidi, you can speak a bit to this, why, well, how many countries, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but what do you think is slowing down this process, especially within the context of the fact that all three of you have highlighted what the benefits are to not just only gender justice, but also from economic justice perspective? Why is it that we're not seeing as much momentum as we would love to see, especially since this is something that's welcomed by different stakeholders, including the movements that we're serving?
Okay, thank you. I know it might come as a surprise to people to hear me say that actually at the stage that we're at, 4 ratifications is not so bad. I think as Mary Kaburu already explained, ratification is a process and it can be quite a lengthy process at national level. We also have to remember that the convention was adopted in June 2019, and less than 6 months later, we saw the emergence of what was going to become a global pandemic. And by March 2020, everybody's attention was focused on how do we curtail this global pandemic. So many parliaments were not even functioning in their normal process. I think but for that, we would have seen a lot more advancement in terms of ratification. Now, from our perspective, the pandemic is actually a reason to accelerate, ratification of these instruments, because it provides so many tools to dealing with some of the fallouts that we've seen: increase in domestic violence, increase in violence and harassment against health and social services workers who are majoritarily women, increase in violence against informal economy workers. But we do recognize that there's a process that needs to happen at national level. We know that many governments are reviewing, for instance, their legislation to ensure that they are in compliance with the requirements of the new instruments, or what they need to do in order to bring their legislation into compliance. And having dialogues with the social partners, so trade unions and employers, but also with wider civil society as well. We know that some governments have completed their ratification process at national level and now need to complete the official process by sending the instruments forward to the ILO. So Italy and Ecuador, for example, have done that. So we do expect quite a few more ratifications, but we know we need to keep the pressure up to ensure that it happens quicker and more widely.
Thank you, Chidi. And I'm really happy that you brought up that perspective of the pretty much complicated process as well with ratification, but also how we've also been destabilized with the pandemic. And, it's interesting that, Mary, you had mentioned earlier on as well about the process in which Kenya is taking for ratification. Can you shed a little bit more light around that? How are you seeing momentum being generated at the national level, but also if you can also highlight what role Kenya is also playing, even as a co-facilitator for one of the Generation Forum, in terms of mobilizing and what do you call it, promoting this particular convention as part of the economic justice framework. Mary?
Thank you, Kemi. For Kenya, I think, like what I emphasized earlier, the C190 is important. And that one, like I also mentioned, is that we have to follow the legislation that is in place to be able to do the ratification of this particular convention. However, one of the things we are also saying is that we can use the existing intergovernmental relationship that we have to see how countries can be able to ratify the C190. That is within the context of the Generation Equality Forum that Kenya is co-leading, using that opportunity to see how we can bring it on board on the other platforms that we have with other countries. And I want to give an example. For example, we are engaging the East African regional countries in trying to end the practice of female genital mutilation. So we are seeing that particular platform as one of the places where we can start seeing how we can be able to bring some of these commitments, some of these strategies that we are developing as an action coalition to see how they can be brought on board this particular platform that we are engaging on other issues, so that we can expand that agenda, not just looking at FGM, but expanding the agenda and trying to see how we can bring the commitments that are emerging from the GEF to be taken on board by other countries. So that is one of the areas that we are seeing is possible. And already, even within the African region, there are other processes that provide an opportunity to bring the conversation on the Generation Equality Forum on ending GBV, including strengthening implementation of policies and legislation. We have the AU meetings that Kenya is a member of the AU, being in Africa. And these are areas that we see an opportunity to see how best we can also bring on board the issue of the C190. So these are some of the things we are seeing. And we are seeing like government can also have the opportunities to leverage on the blueprints and the commitments that are going to be made in Paris to ensure that they integrate ratification of the ILO in their national plans. So these are some of the things we want to see how we can infuse in the various platforms at the regional, sub-regional level, so that we are able to meet the goals of the gender equality forum on GBV Action Coalition. So basically, these are some of the things I would just want to share in terms of how we see this conversation going. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I mean, it's really great to also hear this perspective, because I think there is always a tendency from those from civil society to not necessarily recognize the role that governments can play, not just in terms of mobilizing action at their national level, but how they can play a strategic role in terms of mobilizing action within their sub-region, at the regional level and then also at the global level. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I do want to actually ask Anaya, from your perspective, because we've heard from both Chidi and from Mary, what exactly has been the role, or what sort of strategies are both the women's movement and the labor movement playing to elevate this issue of gender-based violence in the workplace, not just at your national level or the regional level in which you work with, but also at a global level, and to really sort of help to beam the searchlight on this, so that we can actually get more countries to move towards ratification.
Yeah, I think that it's really key, the partnership of the women's movement and the labor movement. But I don't, it has been a divide for a long time for a variety of reasons. And I think that we can see this time as an opportunity to bridge that divide. But it's not something that is going to happen overnight. For example, when we have started, we are basically a labor organization, but we have started working with women's organizations. And when we started doing that, really the question is that, are you going to be instrumental in your collaboration, or are you going to be thoughtful and have a meaningful collaboration? It's one thing to collaborate, to say, we want to do this task together. Another thing is to really say, how can we collaborate in a way that our principles, our philosophies are more entwined in a long-term way? So to just give an example, we have just recently created a training curriculum for women trade union leaders on how to use GBVH as an entry point for freedom of association, for unionization. And in this, we came together with feminist educators, with people who know feminist pedagogy and who have been in the women's movement, to work together to see what are the learnings from the feminist movement, what are the learnings from the labor movement, because these learnings are distinct. And how do we bring them together? Now that makes for an interesting conversation and a meaningful collaboration. So what I'm trying to say is that the collaboration cannot be simply for ratification, which is one tool, but one has to have a variety of activities so that the collaboration has a long-term approach to it, that both movements see as growth opportunities for each other. Otherwise, it becomes a very functional collaboration. And this is why the divide has always been difficult to bridge. So the only way to bridge is to really generate meaningful work together, which really goes to the heart of the problem, brings people together, and not just simply to, perform one task. And that is, so in a way, I am not giving you a quick fix. I understand that this is not something we can just, but then none of us are quick fix people here. So this, this is an opportunity to really bridge this divide in a meaningful way through a variety of collaboration, which will lead to the ratification ultimately.
Thank you, Anaya. And you are absolutely right. Systemic change is not something that can be done with a quick Band-Aid or a quick fix. It's something that we need to sustain those partnerships, sustain those interactions and engagements so that we can actually get the change. So I'm totally, what you just said right now resonated a lot with me, and thank you for reflecting that back to us. And so I want to, just pivot slightly a bit, because I think, with the whole Generation Equality Forum and the work that goes beyond just these 2 moments in time in Mexico and in Paris, but just the process and what comes after that. What are the opportunities really to be able to elevate this work around, you know, economic justice and the intersectionality with gender-based violence? What are the opportunities that you see, Chidi and Mary, for really bringing this into the fold and giving it its, you know, its prominence in terms of this particular space, because it's a unique opportunity. What do you think the opportunities are, and how can you continue to elevate those conversations in those spaces? Mary, would you like to go first? I know Chidi's like, who's gonna go first? Should it be me? Should it be Mary? So let me help you there. Mary, would you like to go first? And then we can come to Chidi.
Thank you, Kemi. Yes, I think we do have an opportunity to, and we see opportunity within the sub-themes of the GBV Action Coalition, because we have top-level priorities, 4 of them, which are in the area of enabling policy, legal and resource environment for ending gender-based violence, and also the other priority on evidence-driven prevention programming for ending gender-based violence against women and girls. And thirdly, the priority on comprehensive, accessible, and quality services for survivors. And lastly, on autonomous women's rights organizations are enabled and empowered to exercise their expertise in addressing gender-based violence against women and girls in all their diversities. So when we look at the action statements for the GBV Action Coalition, we can see that they capture and articulate the ambitions and goals for operationalizing the priorities I've just highlighted. And then we have tactics that give guidance on the approaches that are going to be used to be able to deliver on the goals of the Action Coalition. So when you look at the C190, already ratification and implementing the C190 is emerging as a priority and a clear tactic under sub-theme 1 of the Gender-Based Violence Action Coalition. That is the one on creating an enabling environment. So moving to now we are moving in terms of articulating the sub-targets under the statements. And this is something that will provide an opportunity to ensure that there are also linkages with other action coalitions on economic justice and rights and the other action coalitions. So when we're working on those sub-targets under the action statements, there's an opportunity to ensure that we do have those linkages across the other action coalition groups. So basically, that is what we see, the interlinkages are emerging within the action coalitions within the context of the C190. So that is what we are seeing in terms of the discussions that are emerging around the blueprint, the action coalition. Thank you, Kemi.
Thank you so much, Mary. It's great to hear about also the opportunities for making the connections across other thematics. And so I think that's really critical and exciting to hear that. Chidi, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you. And, you know, again, I'll pick up on that. I think it's really, those links between the action coalitions are absolutely crucial. In the Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition, again, the question of gender-based violence and harassment, and of course, a ratification implementation of C190 and R206 have been critical areas of discussion, and which the Action Coalition has committed to. The mobilization of different stakeholders for the Generation Equality Forums is a huge opportunity, as you said, to really tackle these issues once and for all. Well, I say once and for all, but tackle them in a meaningful way, because we know that these issues are never addressed once and for all. It's always a continuous, you know, struggle to ensure that attention and focus is placed on them, and that the necessary action and measures are put in place. And that's what the Generation Equality Forum enables us to do, in a sense. In the Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition, the link is made very strongly as well to women's reproductive role, and how this often defines not only our place socially, but our place in all economic activity as well. How the gender and social norms attached to these reproductive roles, inhibit women's advancement in terms of political, public life, social life, and economic life, but how also it engenders violence and harassment against women. So there's a strong focus, for instance, in that ECJ, in that action coalition around, the need for investment in care services, and the need to ensure that care is seen not only as something that women do, but something that society has to do collectively, and that needs to be a shared responsibility across genders. We can't address this issue of gender-based violence and harassment without addressing also the social norms and the gender norms that exist in our society, and what gives rise to all of that. So for us at the ITUC, we're extremely encouraged so far at the discussions, the collaborative discussions that we've had in the Action Coalition. We're very much looking forward to the Mexico Forum and then the French Forum, but beyond those, we're looking forward to the new alliances, new coalitions, if you like, of the willing that are being formed through this process. As being really able to embed change that can hopefully be lasting. And just final word to say how much we need it now, because as we all know, if progress was already modest on these issues, if it was already backsliding before the pandemic, we know that it's really unraveling at such a pace at the moment. So again, a critical role for the GEF and for the Action Coalitions.
Thank you so much, Chidi and Mary. I think that's really great insights from that perspective. And I do want to just also take us a bit beyond that, because I think both of you alluded to the fact that the Generation Equality Forum is just one space to mobilize these further commitments. So maybe Anaya, maybe you can speak a little bit more to what you see as the opportunities to strengthen government, private sector, and movements' commitment towards C190 beyond just the GF process. So please go ahead.
Well, I think Chidi may have said this, this moment of the pandemic has really been very revealing for movements and change. The way I look at it is that this is a moment for radical change, not incremental change. So we really have to, this is a moment where a lot of turbulence is going on in our society, and that does not mean slowing down. It means hastening the pace of change. So what we have seen under the pandemic is blatant disregard by multinationals of human rights, women's rights in their global supply chains. This is being unacceptable, and really whatever hopes we may have had in the past has really been shattered by the acts of irresponsibility that the multinationals have perpetrated. So we believe that this is a time to hold our ground and to really build a strong movement for a radical change and a radical transformation and a restructuring of global supply chains, which continues to be one of the dominant modes of operations, economic operations in the world today. So my call out to everybody would be to really focus our work on how we can use this moment to not push back all the lessons we have learned and say, oh, this is really a bad time and we have to like really be measured and in our approach. No, this is a time for the big conversations. So right now, this would be my call for big conversations and for radical change.
Thank you so much. And I think, we can continue to go on. And I'm really loving some of the reflections from all three of you. But I really want to also give some space to our audience. And we've actually gotten some really interesting questions that I would like to throw back to any one of you that would be interested in responding. And so we have two or three questions that have already come through on the chat. One of the questions is from Sunita Suna, who's asking that in addition to the policies, what are the other ways you can respond to GBV? Many a times organizations, institutions, and even countries do not actually implement laws and policies. And that is the truth. We see beautiful laws, we see beautiful frameworks, beautiful commitments, but in its implementation is where the main challenge lies. So, is anyone interested in taking that? What else can we do around that?
I can say from our experience, because I come from a country which actually has a good legislation on anti-sexual harassment at the workplace. However, what we are seeing is that unless we have trade unions at work who understand GBVH, which means that women have to be in the leadership, women workers have to be in the leadership, unless they are really vigilant about the implementation of the act in the factories, the management is only too happy to put the structures in place on paper. For example, in India, we are supposed to have an internal complaints committee in each factory, and it exists on paper. None of them work. In fact, women workers on the ICCs are scared to bring their sexual harassment case to the ICC. So what we are finding is that unless you have freedom of association, unless you have voice at work and women workers in that leadership, it's very difficult to really monitor and make sure that the good legislation is actually implemented. So that is the work that's needed beyond policies and legislation, which is, of course, the work of the government also and the private sector.
Thank you. Chidi, would you like to go? And I would also love to hear Mary's perspective after yours as well on this.
Thank you. So again, can't dismiss the importance of laws and policies, because they really do have to form, the framework, the accountability framework. But it is going to be, in terms of implementation, the role of not just one constituent or one stakeholder. It does have to be, the role of governments in terms of putting in place those policies and legislation that are necessary. It's the role of employers to ensure that workers enjoy their rights to freedom of association, their rights to collective bargaining, can participate effectively in designing the workplace policies that are there to prevent and address and redress violence and harassment, have the confidence through collective power to be able to raise violence and harassment claims when they arise. It's ensuring that other stakeholders, such as the judiciary, the labor inspectorates, etc., are trained and aware of their roles and responsibilities. So going back to that accountability framework, you can again have the most well-designed laws and policies, but if a woman takes a claim, for example, to an industrial court, and you don't have lawyers, judges who are trained on knowing what gender-based violence and harassment is, the bricks start to fall down. Again, all those building blocks start to fall down. So again, going back, and this is what C190 does offer. It is actually this clear roadmap. It touches on all these points, on all the building blocks that need to be put in place in order to address effectively violence and harassment in the world of work.
Thank you so much, Chidi. Mary, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you, Kemi. I think, like the other speakers have said, is that enforcing this kind of legislation and policies is normally a big challenge. And, but some of the things we can think about doing differently beyond the policies and legislation is to ensure that the response mechanisms are there, they are friendly, and that women are able to reach out and get comprehensive services. And in this regard, I'm talking about the survivors. And it's also important to ensure that there are strong coordination mechanisms between both the health, legal, and the judicial system, so that they are able to ensure that justice is accessed by survivors of gender-based violence. And then thirdly, it is also important to be able to amplify the voices of the women so that they do not shy away from taking up action because of fear of reprisal, because they're reporting on GBV. So it's very, very important to be able to carry that kind of high level awareness, to be able to encourage women and to be able to ensure that they can be able to report comfortably so that the right action is taken to enable them continue with their full development in life. Thank you, Kemi.
Thank you so much. And so I think, all of these elements that you all have mentioned are really critical, but also including the fact that we need to also invest energy and time into trying to change those social norms, those perceptions, those attitudes that even perpetuate and heighten gender-based violence as part of the fundamental action. In addition to all of these things that are in place, we need a comprehensive approach. I think someone had mentioned that as well in the conversation about taking a comprehensive approach. So I'm gonna jump into the second question that we have from Adrian, I think, had asked the question that sometimes I see from a legal perspective, employers work from a basic compliance perspective on this issue, and they do the barest minimum to comply, even when legislation is even in place. Any suggestions on how to mobilize and inspire the private sector and employers to move beyond this, beyond the minimum, especially on this issue of gender-based violence? Anyone would like to go on this? Please go ahead.
I can say something. I mean, it's really amazing that employers do not see it in their self-interest to have a violence-free workplace, because that definitely creates for a better workforce that's more productive. There is no doubt that GBVH is leading women to be less productive, to leave work over and over again. So you have to keep retraining the workforce. So it's really in the interest of the employers to create a productive workplace. So that should be an incentive in and of itself. But let me add one more thing, which complicates the global supply chain, where supplier factories in developing countries are producing for fashion brands in Europe and the United States and so on. The fashion brands in Europe and the United States pay pittance for the garment, for the fashion that they buy from the supplier factories in developing countries. They're not paying for the true cost of production. When the fashion brands do not pay for the true cost of making the products, what happens is that you have a workplace where workers cannot be treated, because the money is simply not there to create a workplace which is functional, dignified, healthy. These compliance or a good workplace, any of this, it costs money. It's not free. So when suppliers do not get the right purchasing prices from the fashion brands, they cut corners with the workers, pay less, torture more, get more products done at a higher target, but with less rest, so on and so forth. Then you end up having to coerce the workforce, work harder through violence and harassment. So the thing is that, we are not asking corporates to like totally not make profit, but the excessive greed and profit that exists today is really cutting down on the amount of money that is devoted to the workforce. And that business model needs to be altered. And it's in the interest of the planet, it's in the interest of the employers to do that if people can just move away from very narrow short-term self-interest.
Thank you so much, Anaya. But Chidi, would you like to add to that from your perspective?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, briefly, I would say that I agree. It's obviously in the interests, the self-interest as well of employers to have a working environment that is free from violence and harassment. Very often the short-term view is taken that, it is this mechanism of control. And by the way, the type of production pressures that Ananya was describing are caught within the terms of this convention. So it's not just the violence and harassment that may be required as employers may see it to keep the largely female workforce meeting those targets. It's the very fact of the unrealistic targets that are putting workers at risk to their health and safety that would also be caught up by the provisions of the convention. But I would say that we do know that there are employers out there. We saw this all the way through the lobbying for the standard setting exercise at the ILO and the negotiations of this convention, that there are employers out there who do embrace, the convention and its recommendation, and recognize the value of having an environment that is free of violence and harassment. We need more of them. And again, the role of workers and their organizations, so organized labor, in making that happen is critical. The social dialogue that can happen when you have, an environment that is conducive to that helps employers move beyond the sort of approach that the questioner was referring to. We saw in the wake of #MeToo, for example, many employers reach for these off-the-shelf policies on sexual harassment, in order to try to cover their backs. And the reality being that actually, if you have a serious case and you've done no more than taken a policy and put it in your drawer, it's really not going to help you at the end of the day. And if you have a good and constructive dialogue with workers and their representatives, you will know that, and you will be taking the appropriate and necessary steps to prevent and control incidents of violence and harassment arising in the first place. So yes, still a lot of work to do, but again, I can only emphasize and re-emphasize that at the heart of all of this has to be creating that that enabling environment for good industrial relations and for workers to be able to work jointly with employers to get rid of violence and harassment in the world of work, and of course with governments.
Thanks so much, Chidi. And I apologize, I think it's Adriana that asked that question, and I butchered her name, and I apologize for that. Thank you so much, you both, for that perspective. And I think we have one last question, which I would want for both Anaya and Chidi to speak to, is, and you mentioned this as well in the conversation and in your response to the last question, the fact that violence and the threat of violence and harassment impacts women's ability to raise their voice, and it's used as a form of control. You both mentioned this in throughout this today. Do you know of, or do you think there are any sort of specific protections that can really make a difference, especially for migrant workers? Do you have any specific recommendation on how to be able to uphold the rights of migrant workers in this context of GBV? So who would like to go? Or if we want to continue the tradition, Anaya, you can start, and then we'll go to Chidi from there.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, migrant workers are a big part of the low-wage workforce, and the GBVH. Let me put it this way: there are social identities that accentuate gender-based violence. This can be migrant status. Right now, we are fighting a very huge case of GBV-led murder. in where the woman was Dalit. So in India, we have the caste system. So you can have multiple social identities which accentuate the gender-based violence at the workplace, migrant being one of them. And we have seen different issues that really then add to that dimension. One, for example, is that in certain places, you have migrants who are housed in dormitories, which are uh, also controlled by the employer because of they may not be owned by the employer. They could be owned by the employer, or they could be nearby the workplace or in the compound or supervised constantly. And the dormitories are also places for GBVH because the supervisors, the males, they can go in and out. So for migrants, we really need a much more expanded notion of workplace. It's not only the factory, it could also be the place where they live in. It can be the place where they buy their provisions. So I think that every social identity that accentuates GBVH comes with additional layers that we have to add on to GBVH, which are very legitimate um, under the rubric of GBVH. So that's like a short answer I can give at the moment.
Thank you. Chidi, go ahead.
Thank you, Kemi. And, without wanting to portray the convention and its recommendation as a panacea for everything, it's not by any means what we're saying, but it is a crucial tool. And again, its approach to dealing with the issues of, population groups that are faced heightened incidences of discrimination, of exclusion, of inequality, I think is quite exemplary. And there's specific mention of the need to address migration policies in the convention and its recommendation. There's specific mention of the need to ensure that regardless of status, measures are taken to protect migrant workers from violence, including, of course, women migrant workers, from violence and harassment. I think these instruments are probably as close to an intersectional approach to lawmaking as we've had so far. Certainly there's room for progress on that, but it's certainly a step in the right direction. But ensuring equal treatment, I think, of migrants goes to the heart of what needs to happen. And when I say equal treatment, I just don't mean equal treatment with bad conditions of work being the baseline. We need to ensure that decent work applies and that migrant workers have equal access to decent working conditions as anybody else. And that really does mean looking at the overall framework of legislation and policies that can and social climate, in terms of racism and xenophobia, etc., that operate to exclude migrants and migrant workers, using the other instruments that are at our disposal, such as the UN Convention on migrant workers and all members of their families. The ILO has two strong conventions relating to migrant workers. And in fact, the Convention 190 would require governments to have, regard to these frameworks in transposing it and implementing it. I think making sure that we address discrimination wherever it exists, making sure that we have in our unions as well, the policy, and by policy I mean the approach, the practice that enables migrant workers and other groups facing exclusion, discrimination, marginalization, to have a voice, a strong voice and say, so that they can represent their own interests through collective power, I would say is absolutely fundamental as well.
Thanks so much, Chidi, Anne, and I for that. And I want to thank Leslie Wright for that question. I think it was a really critical piece for us to zoom in specifically on migrant workers. And I'm looking at the time, and I know we have 10 more minutes until we round up the session, but I do want to ask one last question because it did come up in the chat. And maybe Chidi, you can take this for us regarding the ratification. what is ILO doing to engage new countries? And can you remind us of the 4 countries that have actually successfully ratified the convention itself?
Oh, that's a test for my memory. So the latest country to ratify, I think in February this year, was Argentina. The first was Uruguay, swiftly followed by Fiji, and Namibia was after Fiji. So those are the 4 countries that have ratified. I can't, of course, speak on behalf of the ILO, but I can let you know what I know the ILO is up to at the moment. And the governing body, so that's the structure of the ILO, which is tripartite. It has representation from governments, employers, and of course workers, has given the ILO a mandate to develop a strategy for ratification of Convention 190. I know the ILO is working with governments to provide technical support where they are requested to do so from governments. So, and assisting governments with reviewing their national legislation, for instance, is part of that, assisting governments to understand the implications of the convention and its recommendation and what needs to be put in place to effectively implement that is part of the work that the ILO is doing. And of course, a big body of awareness raising work. So I know that they have been, throughout this COVID crisis, for instance, been producing briefings about how these instruments can help deal with some of the instances of violence and harassment that we've seen, including domestic violence, including those terrible incidences that we've seen of, for instance, healthcare workers being spat on by members of the public, transport workers facing the same thing, food retail workers, cleaners, etc. Looking at how you address violence and harassment that happens through information and communication technology. So there is quite a lot of work going on, at the ILO. And a lot of that work is the deep, I guess, work that needs to be done with governments and even in terms of the social partners also building their capacity to understand the instruments.
Great, thank you so much. We didn't mean to test your knowledge, but obviously you had the answers right at your fingertips. So we really appreciate you ruling that out for us because it did come up in the chat and we wanted to make sure that everyone had the right information. So thank you. I want to thank, all 3 of you, Chidi, Anaya, and Mary, for really taking the time out to be able to share your perspective. I've learned a lot from this conversation, but just to sort of recap some of the key things I took away from this conversation, I'm sure many others took a lot more than I did. I think one thing that stuck with me is what you had said, Chidi, about even though we only have 4 that have ratified, the fact is we have made significant progress, bearing in mind that this was actually put in place in 2019. But also, I think what Anaya had also mentioned about the fact that systematic change takes time. And it's really critical for us to really have a really concrete strategy to be able to address this issue that is not just only focused on policies and frameworks, but also really helps us to get at the fundamental issues that gives rise to gender-based violence. And you also mentioned the fact that we want radical change, not incremental. I think we've moved beyond that. And it's important for us to start to think about what are those strategic partnerships that we can form with movements, within movements, but also across movements. What strategic partnerships can we form with the private sector, with governments to be able to move this agenda forward? But also the importance of interlinkages across issues, making the connections to different issues as well that can be able to strengthen the work around gender justice and economic justice. And using spaces like this Generation Equality Forum, but other opportunities and other spaces and other moments in time to really sort of bring to the fore the issues of violence against women and girls, and also other vulnerable persons within the context of work. And finally, I took this because obviously, as a feminist, and it's something that I love to always hear, is the importance of women's leadership and voice across board. And how do we ensure that we have women taking up positions and leaderships within a trade union? How do we have them involved in civil society? How do we have them involved in government to be able to really sort of shine a light on this issue and make sure that we are able to really get to the heart of it? So I want to thank you all three for really, spending the time and really taking us really through some in-depth conversations. Everyone, if you look at the chat, everyone that's participated have shared a lot of accolades about appreciating the depth of the conversation that we've had and hearing your perspectives. And just to sort of, wrap up, I do want to mention the fact that we will have this recording, which we're going to share with all the participants. And also ICRW is going to be writing some insights and recommendations on this issue of gender-based violence and work. And we'll be sharing that as well. But I really also want to appreciate all the participants that took their time to ask questions, to share comments, to share resources, because there are some resources also shared in the chat with us all. And and I'm hoping that we can continue this conversation and really looking forward to learning more. And with that being said, I want to pass it back to Tanya to close us out. Thank you, everyone.
I was on mute. Thank you, Kemi. Thank you to all our speakers. I believe, Mary, you wanted to come in and just say some closing comments. If you're there, Mary. But if not, that's also fine. Thank you, everyone. What a wonderful conversation, and really a pleasure from ICRW to host this event. Mary, would you like to come in?
Thank you very much. It's just to take this opportunity to thank you and to say that we look forward to greater partnership with ICRW, because the partnership at the national level is already there through the Nation Equality Leadership Structure, and we want to nurture this as we move forward the GEF campaign nationally, regionally, and also globally. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Have a great CSW, and we'll see you soon.